It all seems a long time ago, if you look closely at that photograph, where Obama and Chavez are shaking hands, and Chavez, as a friendly gesture, is giving Obama a copy of Eduardo Galeano's book to read, just so that he understands of what has been going on in South America for centuries. At that time, there was still some hope that a new president in the United States might change policies towards South America and allow these countries to be sovereign, independent republics in their own right without any interference. That was the hope in many a South American capital where the Bolivarians were, and in some cases still are, in power. It didn't last too long. And the recent rivalries and assaults on Venezuela by the United States, economic assaults, the imposition of sanctions, and most recently, on the 9th of March 2015, the same Obama shaking hands with Chavez declared, and I quote, "I, Barack Obama, President of the United States of America, find that the situation in Venezuela, including the government of Venezuela's erosion of human rights guarantees, persecution of political opponents, curtailment of press freedoms, use of violence in human rights, violations and abuses in response to anti-government protests, and arbitrary arrest and detention of anti-government protesters, as well as the exacerbating presence of significant public corruption, constitutes an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States. And I hereby declare a national emergency to deal with that threat." Now, when Obama actually made these remarks, not just his critics, but even some of his friends were incredulous. Venezuela constituting a security threat to America or its foreign policy? I mean, was this a joke? Did anyone in the State Department believe this? What all this was part of was a continuous and determined policy by the United States, first under Bush and later under Obama, to destabilize and remove the Bolivarian government from office illegally. And in order to do this, they exaggerated petty incidents out of all proportion to try and give themselves some excuses for this intervention. But let's be clear. Let's cut through the obfuscation. The reason for doing this is that because of the economic crisis brought about by the low oil prices, there's no doubt the government has been in trouble. It's not a secret. The government admits it. It's trying to deal with it. It's calling on economists from different parts of the world to help. Plans are being devised on how best to deal with it. And it's this time that pro-American opposition leaders, funded by the United States for many years now, have decided to launch what they first called an insurrection, the ouster, to remove an elected president from power. Now, if this was the first time this had happened, we would not be too surprised, but we would at least say, well, you know, they're choosing the right moment to do it. But this has happened before, and not against Maduro, but against Hugo Chavez. The only thing they could do after Chavez's successive election victories and triumphs in referendums was to create this completely false picture that he was a dictator.
We have a vote coming up, and I would ask the panel to be brief. I just have a couple of questions. First of all, the U.S. is enabling a dictatorial regime in Venezuela, in my mind, as it continues to routinely violate human rights affairs there in Venezuela.
There is no accountability for the crimes against Venezuelan citizens by an out-of-control regime. It should come as no surprise, as Venezuela's fiscal and economic crisis has deepened, that the Maduro government is radicalizing its tactics.
But second, for years, Venezuela has been in the grips of incompetent buffoons, one after another. First it was Hugo Chavez, now it's Nicolás Maduro. And they have squandered the nation's riches. And third, the country is being run by corrupt and criminal individuals. Just last week, reports came out again alleging that the Speaker of the National Assembly, Diosdado Cabello, is himself a drug kingpin.
Well, he was not a dictator. South America knew that. The Venezuelan people knew that. But in Europe, among certain circles, left liberal circles included, it got around that somehow Chavez was a dictator because he had been in the army once upon a time, and people don't like caudillos. But in fact, Venezuela, under Chavez, produced a constitution voted for by the people in a referendum which the opposition parties opposed, which actually gave the people the right to remove an elected president from power if they so chose, via signatures of a certain proportion, which would trigger an election, a new election, and the president would have to step down. They tried this against Chavez. They failed. I remember very vividly being with the Venezuelan president in Caracas the week before the referendum, and we were sitting together and he was showing me all the opinion poll reports which were coming in. And I said, "How do you feel?" He said, "I think we will win. I hope we will win. But you can never totally trust opinion polls. Something might go wrong." And I said, "And if it does and we lose?" He said, "Well, if I lose, I will step down and we will have a new election." Simple. Now, the interesting thing about this is that no other country in the world has this clause in their constitution that the people have the right to recall a president. So Venezuela, in effect, produced, under Chavez, one of the more democratic constitutions in the world. I mean, and I'm saying this in London, the capital of a country which doesn't have a constitution at all. It's precedent. There's no written constitution in this country at all. The United States certainly does have a constitution, but it was prepared and written a long, long time ago with certain amendments added, but no one ever proposed an amendment to this constitution suggesting that the country be made more democratic, suggesting that senators and congressmen, if corrupt or if the people found something else about them they didn't like, could be recalled in mid-term if the population or the citizens managed to get so many signatures. No, not in the United States, not in France, not in Germany, not in Britain, not in all these countries which are now joining the campaign to try and get rid of Chavez's successor, Maduro. Before that, they had tried a military coup. And it's important to remember this. It was very well depicted in an Irish television documentary, "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." The period of the coup. An Irish company of filmmakers were making a film about Venezuela when the coup attempt took place. And during that coup attempt, Chavez was arrested. The elected president of the country, let me remind you, was arrested, taken to a military camp, and then they found a dodgy businessman who had been measured by a Spanish tailor, so his presidential clothes were made in Madrid because they feared if they did it in Caracas, news of the coup would have spread out. And they got this guy, and he was president for 48 hours. Two things happened when they tried that coup. And it's worth reminding ourselves of them now because similar acts have been attempted against Chavez's successor, Nicolas Maduro. What did they do? They actually removed Chavez, the military, on the instructions of the United States and the total backing of Spain, which was centrally involved in that coup d'etat. We thought at the time that Chavez might be killed. And somehow Fidel Castro smuggled a message to him saying, no need for any heroics. Don't do anything, just stay calm, which he did. And then unexpected things which people who rule dictatorially cannot even envisage happened. The poor came marching down the slums, from the slums, the favelas, and surrounded the presidential palace, and simultaneously large numbers of soldiers in the barracks told their officers, we are not happy that our elected president has been removed, and if you go any further, you're not going to get any support from us. And I remember this incident very well, where a general came to the front of the Miraflores Palace, the presidential palace in Venezuela, and said to the band that was assembled there, when I bring the new president out, this was a military band, he said, when I bring the new president out, you will play the national anthem like you play when the former president used to come. There are going to be many visitors from abroad and foreign journalists, and that's what we want you to do. And this band of soldiers said, but what new president, General? We have not elected a new president. And the general got more and more enraged. Then, realizing that the band was effectively disobeying him, he turned to a 16-year-old peasant boy who played the bugle, a bugler. And this young boy said, excuse me, General, which president? We didn't elect this president. And the general said to him, I don't want to tell you again. You will obey my orders. And when I walk out with the new president in front of the international press, you will play the bugle. And this 16-year-old boy said, General, it seems you're very keen that the bugle should be played. Here, take it from me. Why don't you play the bugle? At this point, the general gave up. And this symbolic event actually depicted that there was very little support amongst ordinary rank-and-file soldiers for getting rid of an elected president. And the combination of threatened mutinies inside the army and the emergence of ordinary people on the streets outside the palace made it difficult for them to do anything. Chavez thought they might have killed him, but they were cleverer than that. They didn't want to make him a martyr. They allowed him to come back, and the coup attempt was over. And the following year, when we marked the first anniversary of the coup, there were 750,000 people in the streets to mark that event, where Chavez spoke and explained what had happened, etc., etc., etc. But I recount these stories not because they are important, which they are, but to show that there has been a consistent and regular pattern to remove, to destabilize, to try and topple the Bolivarian regime in Venezuela. And the reason is very obvious. A, this is the first time in the history of the Venezuelan Republic that they have had a leadership which has benefited the poor. The elites don't like it, and they have never liked it, regardless of which party they belong to. The extreme center in Venezuela didn't care a damn about the poor as such, despite their rhetoric, and they were corrupt to the core. You know, there are stories openly acknowledged of bagmen for Venezuelan presidents being captured on film, stealing money, taking large amounts of money outside the country, etc. At that time, the United States didn't interfere, and they didn't care. And as for human rights, if we really want to talk about that seriously, what did the United States do when in 1989, when the IMF insisted on a special program for Venezuela, which meant cutting various subsidies, including transport subsidies for the poor, there was an uprising. Not a fake uprising, a real uprising. And this uprising lasted for 3 days in and around the suburbs of Caracas, coming into the city itself. And thousands of people were killed by the army on the orders of that government. That is what created the Bolivarian mood in the country. That was when Chavez first came into prominence, opposing that from within the army and saying this must never happen again, that our soldiers are forced to fire on the poor and working class people of our country. That was one reason for his huge popularity, that he was expelled from the army and became a political leader in the country soon afterwards. But if you go back and look at the Western media, the reporting of the massacre of nearly 3,000 people, many buried in secret graves or bodies carted aside, thrown away, there is hardly any coverage of it, including in liberal papers. Condemnation by official NGOs, human rights groups, very little. There was some. A response from the United States government saying they were disturbed, they were worried that so many thousands had been killed in Venezuela. Nothing. Nada. So what are we to make of this absurd and surreal statement from Obama? That it has very little to do with human rights or the imprisonment of certain politicians who proposed to topple a government by force, what they called an insurrection, an ouster, instead of using the constitutional mechanisms available to recall the president. They decided on this particular method. Why? Who gave them the support? Financial and political. We don't know. I mean, it's obvious. I have yet to see the proof, but it wouldn't surprise me to see proof one day, sooner rather than later, that American intelligence agencies were openly or covertly engaged in all this. And this impression, which is now being created that Maduro is a dictator, I mean, people are so ignorant sometimes in the Western world that they don't follow anything or check for themselves. The bulk of the Venezuelan press is privately owned and privately controlled. The large bulk of their television stations are privately owned. They have been hostile to the Bolivarians right from the word go. I remember very well when a television station owned by the big media mogul, the Murdoch of South America, Gustavo Cisneros, his television station depicted a party where Chavez was shown as a monkey, and all the Bolivarians were shown as monkeys. Why? Because they're dark-skinned. This was the first time that someone not from the Creole elite had become an elected president of the country, and the Creole elite did not like it. Just on a personal note here, I have to say that I've never encountered as much racism as I have in Venezuela from from people from within the elite. And amongst all the other reasons for the hatred of Chavez, the most important being that their class rights, their entitlements were being challenged, was the fact that he was dark-skinned. And they contemptuously referred to him as a Zambo, a mixture of slave and indigenous Indian blood, which is true. That how can we, the Creole elite, be ruled by these guys? And that remains a sort of deep instinct and prejudice in most of them to this day. So this racism goes very deep in that country. But the key thing was this, and incidentally, Obama's statement actually had one beneficial effect. It more or less united the continent against the United States. And even a vicious opponent of the Bolivarian experiments in South America, The Economist magazine, which sells more in the US than any other country, was a bit surprised and suggested that perhaps it had been unwise. The Economist of the 21st of March wrote, "The sanctions order targets just 7 senior officials involved in repressing last year's protests or harassing the opposition. It is not directed at the government, nor does it seek regime change, American officials insist. It is hard to disagree that the United States has the right to bar undesirables from visiting its territory or doing business with its citizens, and even to freeze their assets. But far from provoking cracks in the regime, as the administration hopes, the sanctions are likely to solidify it. Polls suggest that Mr. Maduro, whose approval rating has sunk to 20%, has twice as much backing when he poses as a defender of national sovereignty. He will do so at next month's Summit of the Americas. Rather than a celebration of the thaw between Cuba and the United States, this now risks degenerating into a clash over Venezuela. Cuba's President Raul Castro delivered an old-fashioned tirade against the sanctions on March the 17th, a day after his diplomats held a third round of talks with the United States. UNISOR, The Economist continues, has murmured its support for the parliamentary election. Murmured its support? UNISOR was very firm in what it said. Ricardo Patino, the foreign minister of Ecuador, read the communiqué that followed. I quote, "The member states of UNISOR expressed their rejection of the executive order of the government of the United States adopted on March 9, 2015, because it constitutes a threat to sovereignty and to the principle of non-intervention in the internal affairs from other states. The member states of UNISOR reaffirm their commitment to the full respect of international law, the principle of peaceful settlement of disputes, and the principle of non-intervention, and reiterate their call to governments to refrain from applying unilateral coercive measures that violate international law. UNISOR reiterates its call to the government of the United States to evaluate and implement alternative practices of dialogue with the government of Venezuela, under the principles of respect of sovereignty and self-determination of peoples. UNISOR therefore requests the repeal of the executive order." With the exception of Brazil and Mexico, who abstained, all the major Latin American states backed the UNISOR declaration. And going even beyond that, the very popular Latin American leader, the former president of Uruguay, the ex-president Mujica, said on Uruguayan radio, "Just when the relation with Cuba starts to ease and the government of Colombia stops the bombing of FARC, ending more than 50 years long war, the United States, don't fuck me." Anyone who would look at Venezuelan map, check its inhabitants, the GDP, the army, the number of warships and planes, and then say that Venezuela is a threat to the United States, may have lost his or her mind. Now, there's very little doubt that the measures have been extremely unpopular in South America and not taken too seriously. The American government, the Clinton Foundation, Kevin Spacey, Madonna, and a few other Clinton groupies are coming out with nonsense which is based on no facts whatsoever. The real facts are this, that in January, February last year, an extreme right-wing leader of the opposition tried to implement a plan to oust Maduro by taking peaceful protests to extreme lengths, and the evidence is there. Many government supporters were fired on. Some government members of parliament had previously been shot dead on their return home. The aim was very clear. They wanted to oust Maduro by force on the streets. And this is a country which is far from being a dictatorship. The bulk of the media is for the opposition. Two of the leading newspapers of Venezuela have supported the opposition throughout. The government, the Bolivarians, have won despite media opposition. So the notion that the media is being banned or the papers are being suppressed is complete nonsense. One can only look at some of the other allies of the United States in different parts of the world. The Gulf states in the Arab world, democratic. Saudi Arabia, a beacon of democracy, with whom the United States is currently engaged in bombing the Yemen. China, which is a very friendly state to most parts of the world, but certainly is not democratic. The Europeans are queuing up to join the new bank that the Chinese have created as a rival to the World Bank. So what's the problem? The problem with American relations with Venezuela has little to do with human rights. It's essentially a political assault on the Bolivarian states, which the United States never liked, but which they are now determined to get rid of. And the reason they are worried is because they fear that Maduro will win again. So the attempt to slander him, to demonize him, is all part of a package to get Latin America back on side. That is the aim of the American government, and it should be recognized for what it is. And the Venezuelan opposition itself is split. The Lopez, the leader of the extreme right wing of the opposition, is a wild card. I mean, most people in the European governments would find it difficult to have a drink with him. The guy is totally wild. These are people who spat on Jimmy Carter when he went to Venezuela to observe the elections and said they were the freest elections he had ever seen. And when he went into a restaurant, some people were spitting at him. That is the character and nature of the Venezuelan opposition. Vicious, unconcerned with democracy, desperate to claw back however they can the power that they feel was a divine right and that was taken away from them by these dark-skinned radicals. That is effectively what is going on. And it's pleasing in that regard to see that at least 100 members of the English Parliament, the British Parliament at Westminster, have signed a public letter dissociating themselves from any support for the United States in relation to Venezuela. Solidarity, I think, is extremely important.